a self-made millionaire, walked away from the woman he loved. And 6 years later, fate sat him down across from triplets who had his eyes, his jaw, and his stubborn silence. What he did next changed everything. Vivian Cole had spent 34 years learning not to need anyone. Growing up in Thunder Bay, she had watched her mother stretch $40 across a 2-week grocery window, had worn her cousin's hand-me-down winter boots until the sole separated at the toe, had worked the counter at a Tim Hortons through 2 years of night school so she could finish her nursing degree without asking a single person for help. She was not bitter about any of it. She was precise. She knew exactly what things cost: money, time, dignity, and she was careful never to spend more than she had. So when she met Brendan Ashworth at a hospital fundraiser in Toronto, she was already guarded. He was 38, the kind of man who moved through a room as if gravity had agreed to cooperate with him. Founder of a medical technology company, a name in philanthropic circles, the sort of polished that came not from trying but from never having needed to try. Vivian had been there representing the pediatric ward where she worked. Brendan had been there to write a check. They talked for 2 hours. She told him later, much later, when she was still foolish enough to be honest with him, that she had not expected to like him. He had laughed and said he hadn't expected to feel seen. That was the first thing he ever said to her that felt true. They were together for 18 months. She met his mother, Rosalind, a woman who smiled at Vivian the way a customs officer smiles at someone whose passport is flagged, polite without warmth, processing. She met his business partner, a man named Fletcher who called Vivian sweetheart once, and never did it again. She did not meet his wider circle much, because Brendan kept her at a comfortable distance from the parts of his life that were photographed and written about. She told herself it didn't matter. She told herself a lot of things. The engagement happened quietly. He proposed at the kitchen table in her apartment. No restaurant, no audience. Just a ring that had been his grandmother's, and a question that sounded almost shy, which she had not known he was capable of. She said yes before he finished the sentence. She was not a woman who wept easily, but she wept that evening, alone in the bathroom, from something that felt like relief. The wedding was set for the following May. In March, Brendan's mother flew in from Vancouver. Vivian was not invited to the dinner Rosalind requested. She only learned of it the next morning when Brendan arrived at her apartment with the particular quietness of a man who had already made a decision and was working up to telling her. He sat at her kitchen table. He did not take off his coat. He said it wasn't the right time. He said his company was entering a critical expansion phase, and the timing was complicated. He said he needed to pause things, not end them, pause, and that he hoped she understood, and that she deserved someone who could be fully present, and other sentences that Vivian stopped processing after the first two because she had understood, very clearly, what was happening. She asked him once, just once, "Is this your decision or your mother's?" He did not answer immediately, which was answer enough. She took the ring off. She placed it on the kitchen table between them. She said with a steadiness that cost her more than she would ever admit, "Please close the door behind you." He did. She sat in that kitchen for a long time afterward. Then she washed her face, went to work, and did not speak about it to anyone for 3 weeks. Not because she was ashamed. Because she was not ready to say the words aloud and have them become the kind of story that gets told at other people's dinner tables. 6 weeks after Brendan left, Vivian discovered she was pregnant. She sat with that information for 4 days before she let herself feel anything about it. She calculated, she planned. She had a single conversation with her closest friend, a fellow nurse named Daria, who sat on Vivian's couch and said nothing for almost a full minute before asking, "What do you need?" Which was, Vivian thought, the most useful thing anyone had ever said to her. What she needed was time. She would not contact Brendan. She was aware that this decision could be questioned, and she questioned it herself for many nights in the particular darkness that comes at 3 in the morning when certainty stops cooperating. But she also knew, with the precision she had developed across 34 years, that a man who could not make a decision about her, in a moment that mattered, would not become a different man because of a pregnancy. She would not build her children's lives on a foundation she did not trust. She left Toronto. She transferred to a hospital in Kelowna, in the Okanagan Valley, where she had a cousin and manageable rent and enough distance from everything that had happened to breathe. She rented a small house at the edge of a quiet neighborhood, planted a container garden on the back steps, and prepared. The delivery was difficult but not dangerous. 3 boys, triplets, which she had known since the first ultrasound but which still landed differently when the doctor said it aloud. She named them Theo, Miles, and Rafferty. Theo, who arrived first and cried loudest. Miles, quiet from the very beginning, watchful. Rafferty, who looked up at her from the warming table with what she would later describe as tremendous suspicion, as if he already had opinions about the situation. She fell entirely in love with all 3 of them simultaneously and without condition, which was not something she had known was possible before that moment. The years that followed were demanding in every sense. She worked 3/4 shifts when she could, full shifts when she had to. Daria visited from Toronto every summer and called every Sunday. Her cousin Paulette helped with pickups when the hospital ran late. The boys were loud and chaotic and occasionally infuriating, and she would not have changed a single morning of it. Theo grew into a talker, the kind of child who processed everything externally, out loud, in complete sentences that ran into each other without punctuation. Miles was a reader, usually found somewhere impractical with a book, on the stairs, under the kitchen table, in the bathroom with the door locked. Rafferty was the builder, always taking things apart to see what held them together, which was wonderful except when the things he took apart were things that needed to remain together. By the time the boys were 6, Vivian had settled into her life with the particular satisfaction of something that has been difficult and worth it. She was not without loneliness. She was not without the occasional evening where she sat on the back steps, after the boys were asleep, and looked at the orchard view and felt the specific weight of doing everything alone. But she had built something real. She did not take that lightly. And then, on a Tuesday afternoon in October, she took the boys to the community center for Rafferty's swimming lesson, and Brendan Ashworth was standing by the registration desk. He was there, she would learn later, for a board meeting. His company had recently acquired a medical technology firm with a facility in Kelowna, and he had flown in that morning. He was staying at a hotel downtown. He had stopped at the community center because one of his colleagues had suggested the cafe attached to the facility. Vivian saw him before he saw her. She had perhaps 4 seconds of decision-making time, which was not enough. She reached for Rafferty's hand, said something vague to Theo about getting changed, and was halfway to the women's change room when she heard her name. Not her full name, just Vivian. In a tone that meant he wasn't sure, she stopped. She turned around. He looked the same and different in the way that 6 years does to a person. The polish was still there, but something in the set of his shoulders had shifted, as though he had been carrying something heavier than he'd budgeted for. He was looking at her, and then he was looking past her, at the 3 boys who had stopped when she stopped, and were now looking at him with the frank assessment that 6-year-olds apply to strangers. She watched him see it, watched him take in Theo's jaw, Miles's eyes, Rafferty's particular straight-across eyebrow line. She had not looked at photographs of Brendan in 6 years, but she had looked at her sons every day, and she knew exactly what he was seeing. The silence lasted long enough to be uncomfortable for everyone except Miles, who pulled a small paperback out of his jacket pocket and began reading. "Vivian," Brendan said again, differently this time. "We need to get changed," she said. "Rafferty has a lesson." She did not run. She walked steadily through the door. The lesson was 40 minutes long. She sat in the observation area and watched Rafferty splash indignantly through drills and tried to think clearly. Theo sat beside her and narrated every movement Rafferty made, which was usually endearing and was today a mercy because it meant she did not have to be alone with her thoughts. When the lesson ended and she brought the boys out to the lobby, Brendan was still there. He had waited. She hadn't expected that. "I'm not asking for anything tonight," he said before she could speak. I would like to talk, please." It was the please that complicated things. She was not sure she had ever heard him say it quite like that. She gave him her phone number. She told him to call tomorrow, not tonight. She loaded 3 damp, tired boys into her car and drove home through the October dark and sat in the driveway for 10 minutes after the boys went inside, her hand still on the wheel, thinking about what it meant that he had waited. He called the next morning, before she had finished her coffee. They agreed to meet at a cafe near her hospital during her lunch break without the boys. He was already there when she arrived, which surprised her. She had half expected him to be late, to make her wait, to reassert some old dynamic. He stood up when she came in. He had gotten her a tea which he remembered she preferred. "I didn't know," he said when she sat down. "I know you didn't. You could have told me." She looked at him steadily. Would it have changed anything? He opened his mouth. He closed it. It was, she thought, the most honest thing he had done in that kitchen 6 years ago, not answering, and he was doing it again now, and she appreciated it more than any prepared answer. "I don't know," he finally said, "and I know that's not good enough." "No," she agreed. "It isn't." They sat with that for a moment. "I want to know them," he said. "They don't know who you are." "Then I'd like to, slowly, however you think is right. I'm not trying to. I'm not going to disrupt anything, Vivian. He stopped. He pressed his hands flat on the table. "They're mine, and I would like the chance to be something to them." She drove back to the hospital with 10 minutes to spare, sat in her car, and cried briefly and efficiently. Then she washed her face, went in, and put in the rest of her shift. She talked to Daria that evening. Daria, who had very little patience for Brendan on principle but was constitutionally unable to give bad advice, said, "You know this isn't really about him. It's about what the boys deserve. Which means you're going to have to sit with something really uncomfortable for their sake." Vivian knew. She had been sitting with it for 6 years. She also knew that Rosalind was the reason she was sitting with it at all, and that Rosalind, she was fairly certain, did not know the boys existed. She told Brendan she would allow a supervised visit. One afternoon in a public place, with her present, he agreed immediately, without negotiating. She noted that. The visit was at a park. She told the boys they were meeting a man who was an old friend of hers from Toronto. Theo, predictably, had 17 follow-up questions. Miles accepted the information and returned to his book. Rafferty said, "Okay," and then immediately asked if there would be snacks. Brendan arrived on time. He had, she noticed, not worn his usual corporate armor, no blazer, no careful watch. He had come in jeans and a gray sweater, which was either strategic or genuine, and she found she couldn't quite tell which, and wasn't sure it mattered. Theo introduced himself at volume. Miles offered a handshake, which was unusual for him, and which she took as a sign of something she didn't fully understand. Rafferty looked at Brendan for a long moment and said, "You look like us." The stillness that moved across Brendan's face in that moment was something Vivian would think about for a long time afterward. He recovered quickly. He said quietly, "I've been told that." "Why?" said Rafferty. "Because we're related," Vivian said carefully. "We can talk more about that later." Rafferty considered this. Then he said, "Did you bring snacks?" After that afternoon, Vivian spent 2 weeks deciding what to tell the boys and how. She spoke to a child therapist, a soft-spoken woman she already trusted from Theo's school referral, who gave her language and a framework, and the reassurance that there was no perfect way to do this, only an honest one. She sat all 3 boys down on a Friday evening, after dinner, and told them that Brendan was their father. She used simple words. She answered what she could. She said that he had not known about them when they were born, and that now he did, and that he wanted to be part of their lives if they wanted that. Theo cried. Miles put his book down and did not pick it up again for the rest of the evening. Rafferty asked 4 practical questions in rapid succession. Where did he live? Did he have other kids? Did he like Lego? Would he come to the school science fair? And Vivian answered each one as steadily as she could. She held it together until all 3 were asleep. Then she sat on the back steps and let herself feel everything she had been filing away. She had not told Brendan about the conversation with the boys. She had not told him about the therapist, or the Friday evening, or the 4 questions Rafferty had asked. But the next time Brendan called to arrange a visit, she said, "They know who you are now," and she heard what the silence on his end of the line contained. In the months that followed, Brendan came to Kelowna 6 times. Then he arranged to work remotely for a portion of the month, staying at a hotel 20 minutes from her house. The visits became regular. Theo warmed to him fastest, which Vivian had expected. Theo warmed to most people fastest. It was simply his nature. Miles took longer, watching from a careful distance, and then one afternoon showed Brendan a book he had been reading about plate tectonics and asked him 3 questions, which meant something significant in Miles's particular language. Rafferty remained the most evaluative, the most likely to ask pointed questions about intention and follow-through, which Vivian found both exhausting and quietly fair. Brendan was not, she admitted to herself, doing this badly. He did not try to be entertaining or impressive. He showed up. He was on time. He listened to Theo's extended monologues with visible patience. He brought Miles a book about the geology of the Canadian Shield, which had apparently involved actual research. He sat on the kitchen floor with Rafferty and helped disassemble and reassemble a broken alarm clock with the focus of someone who had nowhere else to be. She watched all of this with the careful attention of someone who was not yet willing to trust it. What she had not expected was his mother. Rosalind arrived in Kelowna unannounced, a fact that Brendan told Vivian apologetically over the phone the night before, having only learned himself that morning. Rosalind was 63, sharp-eyed, and had apparently heard about the boys from Brendan's assistant, which meant Brendan had told his assistant, which meant the information had been moving through circles Vivian had not anticipated. She met Rosalind at the hotel, without the boys. It was important to her that this conversation happen without them present. Rosalind sat across from her in the hotel lobby restaurant and did not waste time. She said she wanted to make something clear. She had not known about the pregnancy. If she had, things would have been different. Vivian studied her for a moment. Would they? He listened to me too much, Rosalind said. I know what I did. I convinced him that the timing was wrong, that he needed to focus. I didn't consider what the consequences were for you. That was wrong of me. She paused. I'm not asking you to forgive me. I'm telling you the truth. Vivian said nothing for a moment. He chose to listen, she said finally. Yes, he did. Rosalind held her gaze, but I made it easy for him to make the wrong choice, and you paid for it. It was not an apology in the conventional form, but it was more honest than Vivian had expected, and she was someone who valued honesty in proportion to its cost. And this one appeared to have cost Rosalind something real. She did not soften, exactly, but she noted it. What she discovered next, she discovered by accident. There was a woman. Brendan had dated her briefly, in the year following the engagement being called off. A woman named Sherilyn who moved in corporate Toronto circles, and who, Daria mentioned in passing during a Sunday call, had apparently been in contact with Rosalind around the time Brendan and Vivian were together. It was Daria who had first heard this, from a mutual contact, years ago, and had not mentioned it because she hadn't seen the point. The point, it turned out, was that Sherilyn had known Rosalind socially before Brendan and Vivian were ever together. That the dinner in March, the one Vivian hadn't been invited to, had included Sherilyn. Vivian sat with this for a week. She did not say anything to Brendan. She turned it over in her mind, examining it, the way she examined any piece of information she was not yet ready to use. She said something about it only once, and not to Brendan. To Daria, on a Thursday evening while the boys were doing homework and the kitchen smelled like the pasta she had on the stove. She didn't invent anything, she said. He still made the choice. Yes, said Daria, but it wasn't random. Someone helped him make the wrong one. Yes. Vivian stirred the pasta. I needed to know that. I don't know why, exactly. But I needed to know it wasn't just that he looked at me and decided I wasn't worth staying for. He was an idiot, Daria said. But not that kind of idiot. She brought it up with Brendan on a Sunday afternoon in January, when the boys were at Paulette's and the house was briefly quiet. She told him what she knew. She was direct about it. She had not built 34 years of precision to stop being direct now. Brendan listened. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, I should have asked better questions before, about why my mother wanted that dinner, about why she'd decided suddenly that the timing was wrong. I should have asked, and I didn't, because it was easier not to. Why are you telling me that? Because I spent 6 years being a person who didn't ask enough questions. I'm trying to stop doing that. It was not a grand declaration. It was a quiet acknowledgement from someone who had learned something the hard way, and she appreciated it for exactly what it was. Let's take a small pause here. If you've read this far, type the word maple in the comments. You'll understand why in a moment. Spring arrived, and with it, something Vivian had not planned for. She came home from an evening shift to find Brendan sitting on her front steps, which he had taken to doing on the evenings he was in Kelowna and had finished work. The boys had given him a house key 2 months earlier, a decision they had made collectively and announced to her as a done deal, which she had chosen to receive as the gift it was meant to be. He had a coffee for himself and a tea for her, which was still the gesture she was least prepared to harden against. She sat beside him on the steps. I've been thinking, he said. About whether I'm doing this right. About whether I'm just showing up or actually showing up. He turned the cup in his hands. There's a difference, and I think I've been closer to the first one than I want to admit. She did not respond immediately. Rafferty asked me last week, he continued, whether I was going to keep living in a hotel. He said it in that way he has, like it's just a question, but it's actually a verdict. Vivian almost smiled. That is his way. I know, I'm learning his ways. He paused. I want to be here. Not just in Kelowna sometimes. Here. I know that's a lot to say. And I'm not saying it to create pressure, or to make anything harder. I'm saying it because I think you deserve to know what I actually want, and to make your own decision about it with full information. She looked at the darkened street. A car passed. Somewhere up the block, a dog was registering an opinion. You hurt me, she said. It was not said with heat. It was simply a fact she had been carrying that she had decided just then to put on the table between them. I know, and I built something without you. This, she gestured toward the house, toward the boys sleeping inside, toward the container garden on the back steps, and the third-shift nursing schedule and the 6 years of Fridays that had been hers alone. This is mine. These boys are mine. They're yours now too, because that's right and because they want it to be. But it's mine. Yes, he said, it is. I need you to understand that, fully. I do. She picked up her tea. She let the silence sit. I'm not ready to answer the question you're not quite asking, she said. But I'm not. She stopped. I notice things. I've been noticing them. That's all I'll say. He did not push. He nodded, and they sat together on the steps for a while, drinking their respective drinks, watching the quiet street. He moved to Kelowna 4 months later. He did not ask her first. He asked the boys, which she only learned about afterward, from Theo, who recounted the conversation in full detail, including the part where Brendan had said he wanted to make sure they were comfortable before he talked to their mom about it. She had held that detail quietly for 2 days before she knew what it meant to her. What it meant was that he was, finally, asking the right questions. The conversation she had been quietly avoiding having with herself became unavoidable sometime in late September, on a Saturday when the boys were at a birthday party, and she was at the farmer's market alone, which she almost never was, and she was standing in front of a table of late-season apples and thinking about nothing in particular, when she realized that the previous Thursday evening, when the 5 of them had made soup from scratch, and Miles had gotten competitive about who could chop the onion smallest, and Rafferty had burned himself slightly on the pot and then refused to admit it hurt, and Brendan had noticed and gotten the first aid kit without making it a thing, had been one of the best evenings she could remember. Not in spite of the ordinary chaos of it, because of it. She bought the apples, she drove home. She sat in the driveway again, which had become her thinking place. When she went inside, she called Daria. I think I've already decided, she said. I know, said Daria. You knew before me. By about 3 months. She asked Brendan to come for dinner the following Friday. Just him, not during a boys' activity afternoon, a proper dinner after the boys were in bed. He arrived with a bottle of wine she didn't actually drink and a sparkling water she did, because he had remembered, and she found she could no longer pretend that every small correct thing he did was strategy. She told him she was willing to try. She was not romantic about it. She did not dress it up with sentiment or certainty. She said she was willing to try, and she needed him to understand the weight of that, and she needed him to know she would not wait a second time if he made her wait again. He said he understood. He said, I'm not going anywhere, she said. Don't say it unless you mean it, he said. I mean it. They talked until nearly midnight. It was not a dramatic evening. It was just 2 people at a kitchen table, being honest with each other with the lights on. Brendan proposed in February, which was not a romantic month in Kelowna, but which was when he asked, on a Sunday afternoon, in front of the boys, because he had asked the boys first, separately, seriously, including Rafferty, who had conducted what could only be described as a brief interview about intentions and follow-through before ultimately pronouncing the proposal acceptable. The ring was simple. The question was quiet. Vivian's answer, by the time he finished asking, was already formed. The boys lost their collective composure immediately. Theo cried. Miles pumped his fist once, precisely, and then looked embarrassed about it. Rafferty said, finally, with the satisfaction of someone whose logistics had been resolved. The wedding was small, in July, in the backyard of the house that was still, and would always be, hers. Paulette came. Daria came and wore something impractical and perfect. Brendan's assistant came. A few colleagues. Rosalind sat in the front row and did not try to give a speech. The boys wore matching white shirts and refused to wear the ties for the ceremony, but agreed to hold them, which Vivian decided counted. Rafferty carried the rings. Miles read a short passage he had selected himself from a book about mountains, and Theo delivered remarks that he had written out in full, and which ran 4 minutes over the intended length, and were entirely worth it. Brendan and Vivian stood facing each other in the afternoon light, the orchard visible beyond the fence. The boys ranged beside them like something she had built with her own hands. "I'm sorry for the years I cost us," Brendan said, in his vows, without looking away from her. "And I'm grateful every day that you built something so good in them. I won't waste any more time." She had written and rewritten her vows 4 times. What she finally said was simpler than any of the drafts. "I chose myself," she said, "and I chose our boys, and now I'm choosing you, not because I need you to, because I want to. There's a difference, and I know you know it." He did. That evening, when the guests had gone and the boys were asleep in the house that had held them through 6 years of ordinary, extraordinary life, Vivian and Brendan sat on the back steps in the summer dark. The Okanagan Valley spread out below them, warm and still. The container garden had overgrown its pots entirely by then, and was tumbling cheerfully over the steps, which she had decided to interpret as abundance. She leaned against his shoulder. He did not say anything, neither did she. Some of the things that matter most arrive without announcement, in the middle of Tuesday afternoons, and Thursday evenings and ordinary Sundays, and you only understand what they were when you're sitting quietly enough to feel the weight of everything that held.